So the title is Ohio's Latino Communities as a Teaching and Learning Resource, and I thought I sort of got that off of y'all's syllabus. So here's an overview of what I wanted to talk about. We may go off in other directions, but I want to talk about who I am and why I'm here, give you some sort of background about how I relate to the Hispanic communities here. I'm going to talk about experiential learning in Spanish at OSU. And specifically, I want to talk about that Spanish in Ohio course that Carol was mentioning, because it relates to the course that y'all are doing now and to courses that y'all might teach, those of y'all who are teachers, or to projects that you might do with students of yours, even if you're not a Spanish teacher. We want to look a little bit more closely at Ohio's Hispanic communities. I know that Victor Mora was here on Monday, and he talked about demographics of Hispanics in the US and in Ohio. But I want to talk specifically about Columbus and some communities and different resources that you have among the Hispanic community here. And that's where if you want to stop me and say, well, very specifically, what do I do? I'm happy to talk to you about that, okay? Either during the presentation or later, if I'm still alive. And then we need to talk about the role of service learning in all of this, because I don't think anyone has specifically talked about service learning in so many words, right, this week, okay? And then give you some examples of student journals or products, and also the products that we have them create in our courses. And then we will talk about using real people, just some very general ideas about how to use real people as a resource and some of the challenges that actually poses. So who am I and why am I here? I grew up monolingual and monocultural, and you really could not have gotten more monolingual or monocultural than I was growing up in Tidewater, Virginia. I am now a phonologist and a dialectologist by trade. And so I studied phonology and theoretical phonology and dialectology. But once I came to Ohio State 27 years ago, I became very practical about everything that, even though I had studied phonological theory, I've never been happy sitting squarely in theory if I couldn't get my hands dirty doing something that theory helped to explain. So my teaching has also always been very hands-on, and I'm going to give you some examples of that from the Hispanic community. And I just published a book called, it's a phonetics book in Spanish phonetics, and it's called Sounds in Context, an Introduction to Spanish Phonetics, I'm translating here, with special reference to real life, con especial referencia a la vida real. And so everything that I do, whether it's raising children in Westerville, Ohio, or teaching or doing research, it always has to do with the real world. So don't send me off into theory land and expect me not to return to the real world. So I do phonology in the real world, dialectology in the real world, Spanish in the real world. So I am never happy to just give students Spanish examples from textbooks or from the library. They have to go out and use the real world. My teaching research, and then also I think all of us are concerned citizens. And that's one reason why I think you can be especially happy doing your teaching and research in the real world, because you're a concerned citizen. So let me talk a little bit about experiential learning in Spanish at OSU before we had, and since we've had, the Spanish in Ohio class. I'm just going to give you some examples of things that I do in my own teaching. And these are actually related to things that any of y'all can do. In Spanish phonology, we talk about the sound system of the language, okay? So I teach a phonology class, a phonetics class, and I teach a pronunciation class. In fact, Siduri had my phonology class last year. She can vouch for the fact that we talk about real-world things in phonology class. But I teach an undergraduate phonetics, it's a baby phonetics class, where we really just, it's remedial pronunciation for students who need to work on their Spanish pronunciation. And so the cool thing about pronunciation, thank you. The cool thing about teaching pronunciation is that you can use examples from anything, from any story or joke or license plate or book jacket or CD cover or anything, because all you need is to get the students to pronounce. So I try to think of cool things that will pull the students in, something that touches every student in the class. So when I see, after you've been in class for 3 or 4 weeks and you see that there's some guys sitting over in this side of the room and they don't ever participate, and you've got all these women over here in Spanish class, even in Spanish linguistics, it's mostly women. You have just a few handful of guys. So you go and you go to the ESPN or the MLB website for in Spanish, and you get the names of all of the Spanish names for all of the Major League Baseball teams, and then you present them to the class and you divide them into groups and you say, okay, the first group that figures out what all these names are, wins the prize. So you always think of something that's going to touch everybody. And so it occurred to me that Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztecs, right, an indigenous language of Mexico, there are a lot of these cool Nahuatl words that end in TL, all right, and that have come into Spanish, and then they've actually come into many other languages, most languages of the world. So you have words like tomate, tomato, and chocolate, chocolate, and coyote, coyote, and ocelote, ocelot. These are all words that in Nahuatl would end in TL. But the coolest part of them is that they don't have the sounds b, d, and g in them. And that's because Nahuatl doesn't have b, d, and g. It only has p, t, and k. And so I came up with this really cool list of Spanish words that has only p, t, and k and no b, d, g, because it's for the day that we're talking about p, t, and k. And we're teaching our students not to aspirate their P's and go Paco, and they're supposed to say Paco, and they're supposed to say taco and not taco, right? And so in order to practice that, you just need words. But the best words are the words that have lots of P's, T's, and K's. So Nahuatl loan words were perfect, okay? So I came up with a list of words from Mexican Spanish. And the cool thing about this list is that if you're not Mexican, you don't know what they mean. All right? Now, there's a word or two that would be an exception. So we have, as the people might have heard of cacahuate. Outside of Mexico, nobody says cacahuate, but they do say cacahuete in Spain, all right? But they say maní everywhere else, right? So believe it or not, even though our textbooks present words like this as if it were a standard Spanish word, it actually is a Mexicanism, and it's a word that outside of Mexico is not used. So I teach the students, we pronounce these words, and then I send them to the West Side to find out what the words mean. In other words, they just have to get in touch with Mexicans, right? So the first time I did this is I showed up in class with the yellow pages, and I had them get out their cell phones. We're always complaining about how students have their cell phones in class. You've got to just, you go with the flow. And so I said, okay, everybody got their cell phone. And I assigned, we divided into small groups, and I gave, each one had to call a different grocery store, and Latino grocery store, and then ask what the word meant. And it really works. What happens is after, doing that once, it occurred to me that I couldn't harass, right? I was going to think of some other way to say it, like, take advantage of the goodwill of the grocers on the West Side, right? So now what I do is I show up in class and I give them phone numbers of my Mexican friends who are all over the U.S., but of course with a cell phone, it doesn't matter if they're in San Diego or Tucson or Chicago or where, right? Okay, and another thing that we've done, I've sent them to the West Side, to the store where y'all just were, right? I've had students go there and look through the cereal aisle and make a list of the different cereals that they find with the boxes in Spanish. And what they have to do is come back and tell me whether the cereal box, addresses the consumer as tú or usted. Now, do y'all all know enough Spanish to know that there are two forms of you? There's a tú form, which is a familiar form, and there's an usted, which is what we call the form or the polite form. And so whenever a Spanish speaker says anything in the second person, they have to decide, although it might be subconsciously, they have to make a decision, am I going to call this person tú or usted? And so it defines relationships, right? And so the students, of course, they go and they dutifully look at the different cereal boxes and they come back with their list. And then we try to decide what's the difference between tú and usted. And in terms of cereal, what is the difference? The more sugar in the cereal, the more tú. The more fiber in the cereal, the more usted, right? Because obviously there are cereals that are for adults and there are cereals that are for children, right? And so this is a way you can use the West Side to your advantage, right? And of course, then we have the fact that Spanish speakers in every country in the Spanish-speaking world say Pepsi quite often instead of Pepsi. And this has to do with a phonological phenomenon which I won't go into detail about because unless you're a phonologist, you won't be interested, I assume. But in syllable final position, for millions and millions of Spanish speakers, there is no difference between a P and a K sound. And so it doesn't matter what country you're from, there are speakers who say Pepsi instead of Pepsi. And in Argentina, there's even a campaign, advertising campaign where they used that spelling of Pepsi to make fun of people who say Pepsi. So what I do is I send the students out after we study this phenomenon. I send them, I say, this weekend, your assignment, and I'm being serious, is to go order a Coke or a Pepsi. And where I come from, we call them all Cokes. It doesn't matter whether they're Cokes or Pepsis or Dr. Peppers, we say it's a Coke. So I tell them to go to the to Wendy's or to Burger King or La Bamba or anywhere they want to go and make sure they're waited on by a native Spanish speaker. And they're supposed to ask for a Pepsi, or they want to ask for a Diet Pepsi, then that's okay too. But and I say they cannot say Pepsi. And of course the students don't want to do it because it's embarrassing and they're going to make fun of me, they're going to think I'm stupid. And then it's interesting when they come back and they say they didn't even notice. And I say, I rest my case. Because Spanish speakers don't notice. Pepsi and Pepsi are exactly the same thing. Okay, so what we did though, I want to go into detail about this, this course, Spanish in Ohio. And to give you some background information, we actually proposed this course back in 1994, when the landscape here in Columbus was very different from what it is now. The Hispanic landscape, there was none really. I mean, it was still back in the early 90s, believe it or not. Those y'all are so young that you don't remember this, but I can remember being in a shopping mall and hearing Spanish and turning around and saying, where are you from? You know, ¿de dónde eres tú? Because it was so unusual to come across a Spanish speaker in Columbus, Ohio. So things have changed quite a bit, but it's important to notice that we did this. We started this course and we started this as part of our experiential program back when there was no Hispanic community in Ohio in Columbus to speak of. And that's important because it says you set your mind to something and it'll simply work out. Now maybe what happened was, you know, we started this and because of that, Spanish speakers flocked to Central Ohio. I tend to think that wasn't the case. But so what we wanted to do, a colleague of mine who has since retired, Donna Long, she and I desperately wanted to have a study abroad requirement. And we wanted to have, we wanted to also require that all courses at the, sort of having an episode here. We wanted all of our courses to be taught in Spanish all the time. And the level of Spanish of the students just wasn't what it needed to be. And so in order to institute a study abroad requirement, being that we were a public university, right, we couldn't just say everybody must go abroad without giving them the wherewithal to do it. And so we did try our best, you know, at OSU to create study abroad scholarships and that sort of thing. But really what we did was we had an out. For those who could not study abroad because of their families, because of their jobs, because of money, they could take a course that we were going to create called Spanish in Ohio, where they would do study abroad in Franklin County, Ohio. And of course, our colleagues thought we were crazy. And they said, I don't know how you're going to do that. But we said, if we have to use videos, if we have to use radio, if we have to pipe in Spanish language TV, which was not available on cable at the time. We said we will do it, and we actually put the course together. And this is what it looks like. It's called an experiential course for selected majors. The students have to, they can only get in there by permission, but all of our majors, once they've had the prerequisites, are welcome to take it. We actually have class for 35 hours during the first 5 weeks of our 10-week quarter. Okay, so that's 7 hours a week we have class. But then this last 5 weeks we don't have class, and students are off doing their projects and working on their hours. They have to cover 100 hours outside of class using their Spanish, okay, in an immersion setting for 100 hours in 10 weeks, which is 10 hours a week. That's a lot of hours outside of class. They have to keep a journal in which they document everything that they're doing for those 10 hours a week, and they have to come up with a final product. I will come back in a few minutes to talk about the journal entries that our students have done. I've actually brought some of their journals with me from several years ago, and I will show you some of the products that they came up with. But first, I think I'd like to talk a little bit more detail about Ohio's Hispanic communities. You've seen maps and census figures from Victor Mora on Monday, but I want to give you some a comparison with the rest of the U.S. I'm going to talk about 2 historical Spanish-speaking communities in Ohio. Did Victor mention that, I wonder, the other day? No. Okay. And then we'll talk about Latinos in Columbus, and of course look at the ethnolinguistic diversity that we have. So first of all, let me just recap some of this is obvious, I think, to all of us. We already, before you even came and took this course, you had in your minds an idea of what the Hispanic landscape of the U.S. looked like, and it looks very much like this, where there are many Hispanics in the Southwest, but more and more in all urban areas, really. This is actually, by the way, from the 2000 census, so Victor, I'm sure, brought much more recent figures with him. But of course, what we do is we look at Ohio, and we see that there are more in the north than there are in the center and the south, but but all of Ohio is becoming pinker and redder, or como se diga. Okay, this is what Ohio looks like, and this is what the how the Ohio Hispanic population breaks down by nationality. So we have 41% Mexican, 30% Puerto Rican, a large segment of other Hispanic. And I don't know if y'all asked Victor what those other Hispanics were, but when you've got Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Central Americans, South Americans, what could other Hispanic possibly be? And the only thing might be Spaniards or Dominicans, but that 18% are clearly just, it's a mismatch of people who didn't identify as anything else in particular. And again, this is from the 2000 census, and so I assume that Victor brought more updated data. But I think it's useful for us to compare that with the graph that we just saw with the rest of the U.S. Because in the U.S., fully 2/3 of the Hispanics in the U.S. are Mexican, whereas and less than 10% are Puerto Rican, or around 10%, let's say. But in Ohio, it's fewer Mexicans and a much larger Puerto Rican, and also the other Hispanic is very large in Ohio. And in fact, if you look at the map by county, this has always been my favorite map. I hope that Victor showed this to y'all the other day. But you'll notice that the Puerto Rican population is much heavier, a much greater percentage of the total Hispanic population in the urban Northeast, okay? And so in Cleveland, in Lorain, in Youngstown, Warren, in that area, there's a large Puerto Rican population, whereas the Mexican population is much higher in Northwest Ohio, perdón, and especially in the rural areas, the rural counties of Northwest Ohio. And then look in Southern Ohio. The other is a huge category, because it's not any one Hispanic group in particular that has come and settled there. It's In Central Ohio, for years, it's been just professionals, Hispanics from all over the Spanish-speaking world who have been at, with the businesses around here, with the university or what have you. And so what we end up with as far as sort of a traditional population of Hispanics in Ohio is we have two communities. Northwest Ohio is the population that came from Mexico in the 50s, and they settled in the rural counties, and then since then they have migrated to Toledo, their children and their grandchildren. But these were farm workers, by and large, who may have then moved to work with the agricultural processing plants, maybe with the tomato factories and packing plants and places like that in Northwest Ohio. And in the Northeast, it is people who came from Puerto Rico to work in the steel mill in the 40s and 50s. Now, more recently, in the past decade, there's what I have called an immigrant overlay. And so from central and southern Mexico, we have immigrants coming in who are different from the group that came in the 50s. And that's what we're seeing around here, where we ate today, for example. And also from Central America, especially Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And whenever I point this out, about Guatemala and El Salvador in particular, I always like my students to realize that migrations, y'all have talked a lot about migration. The whole course is really about that. I guess you've talked about the fact that this has to do with everything you've ever heard about politics and war and economics since you were born. Wars and economies are what make people move in the first place, right? And so when we talk about there being a lot of Salvadorans here, it's not a quirk. It's not just something out of the blue. And so when I think back, for example, of what was going on in the 70s and in the 80s in Central America, I can't help but think, wow, that's what this is a result of. It's not just something, just a fluke. It's good to tie things together, Okay, and then interestingly though, in spite of the fact that there's an immigrant overlay that includes elements from other places besides Mexico, there still is a very strong Mexican influence, in fact stronger than ever I would say, in the press, in entrepreneurship, and then Mexico even has a consular office that they, is it still mobile or do they have, anybody know? Come on.
Here?
Uh-huh. Mobile. But so the Mexican government has acknowledged the fact that there are lots of Mexicans in Central Ohio. And for a phonologist or a dialectologist, one of the things that's interesting about this is that Ohio is a fascinating place to study what we would call dialects in contact. You might have heard, it's obvious when you have languages in contact, and so you have English, people who speak English and Spanish in the same space, and they end up speaking what we would call Spanglish, right? The same thing could be said about dialects in contact. And so those of us who work in Spanish or teach Spanish and do Spanish linguistics find it fascinating that we have people from different dialect areas that are very, very different. Puerto Rican Spanish, for example, and Mexican Spanish, which are just about as far apart as you can get on the dialect continuum in Spanish. To have those people sharing a space in Cuyahoga County is really interesting. And so to see what would happen with the next generation that's going to hear Mexican Spanish and Puerto Rican Spanish, how in the world are they going to turn out, right? And the same thing, interestingly, you're finding all over the Spanish-speaking world. There are other places where this is going on in a big way. One of them is Spain, where there are millions of Latin Americans now. In a place that didn't used to have migration, really. When I first studied in Spain, Spain was very homogeneous, and it's a very different place now. And then you go somewhere like Chile, where there are Peruvian immigrants, and you go somewhere like Argentina, where there are Paraguayan and Bolivian immigrants, and you see that dialect contact is big all over the place. Okay, so Latinos in Columbus, where in the world would we go to find them? I probably don't need to tell y'all, because you work with Latinos, you know something about where they live. But one way to find out is just to look at the entrepreneurship that has sort of sprouted up to take care of them, right? And so I did a Google search this morning, La Michoacana, Columbus, Ohio, and this is what I came up with. There were 6 La Michoacana grocery stores identified, and those are probably the 3 biggest concentrations of Latinos in Columbus. The west side, where we are right now, the southeast over near Whitehall, Hamilton Road, Broad, and around through there, and then 161 Cleveland Avenue, Morse Road, and around through there. If you ever need, I guess one of the best places to get more specific about where to find Hispanics is to pick up any of the Hispanic newspapers. Have y'all looked at La Voz Hispana and Fronteras and some of those places, and look at what the ads are what they're advertising and where those places are that are advertising to Hispanics. As far as ethno-linguistic diversity, we can look at what was the traditional core Spanish-speaking world, and Ohio doesn't seem to be part of it. But interestingly, Western Sahara and the Philippines are. And I dare say that there are more Spanish speakers in Ohio than there are in the Philippines and Western Sahara. But just to give you an idea of what Hispanic Ohio looks like outside of the census data, right? There's a billboard from Lorraine urging Puerto Ricans to vote. That's in Toledo. This is the most festive photo of a Latino grocery store I've ever taken. That's in Fremont. This is in northwest Ohio in the strawberry fields. This is in Whitehall at a Salvadoran restaurant making pupusas. This is Lincoln Park West apartment homes about 10 years ago. Now it's called something else, I think, but that's just over right next to where we had lunch today. These are Mexican kids at the swimming pool there. And these are my own children who are sort of Hispanic. You're as Hispanic as you think you are, right? Their mother is from Spain. And although I would say I'm more Hispanic than she is, I think. You know? So I wanted to give you some sense. I don't know to what extent this is interesting to y'all. From my conversation at lunch today, it struck me that maybe y'all would want to hear some of the differences in the different dialects of Spanish. And so I'm going to give you some samples from Northwest Ohio and from Lorraine so that you can compare, and then from an immigrant here in Columbus, although I'm not sure I have him on video. We'll see. Okay. But let me I want to just hit the high spots. I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are just about 2 things I want you to know about Northwest Ohio Spanish versus Northeast Ohio Spanish. In the Northwest, this is Mexican-American. And the features that you find there are typically Mexican-American, which is to say, it's based on Mexican Spanish, which is a very consonant-heavy dialect of Spanish. What that means is that when you read Spanish, you read, consonants and vowels, by and large, if there's a consonant written there, you're going to pronounce it. In other words, consonants don't disappear when people talk. They're intact. Especially the best bellwether for consonant weakness is the S. So final S's, for example, in a Spanish word like estos, all right? Estos. In many dialects of Spanish, they say esto or they say eto, and the S's disappear if they're at the end of a syllable or at the end of a word. In Mexico, that does not happen. It's what we call a consonant-heavy dialect. And so Northwest Ohio Spanish is Mexican-American, consonant-heavy. There are a few things that do happen to consonants that don't happen in Mexico, interestingly enough. Although some of them happen in northern Mexico. And I need to point out that, as a general rule, more immigrants to the U.S. came from northern and central Mexico in the 50s. As opposed to now, here in central Ohio, we find many people from Oaxaca and Chiapas and farther south in Mexico. And so even though they're coming from the same country, it's a very different migration, a different wave. And in fact, the phonology is a little bit different, but as big as Mexico is, it's amazing that Mexican Spanish is as homogeneous as it is. The only other thing I'm going to say is that if you'll look down here, I mentioned some, well, there's some lexical things, so certain words that are used in rural Mexico, and they're also used in the Northwest. So asina, for example, for así instead of así, for that way. And then, of course, a lot of loan words that are just typically Mexican-American because they're part of that whole migrant culture, that agricultural migrant culture. So trailita is for like a trailer that you live in, a house trailer, and Minnesota for Minnesota. And many, many others, okay? And then some other morphological things. I won't go into all of these things, but I did want to mention code mixing. And code mixing meaning where Spanish and English are mixed. Okay, so Mexican Americans are obviously going to mix Spanish and English because they're in an English-speaking world, and yet they're native Spanish speakers. Or second generation, they're native Spanish and English, and so just like any children growing up in a bilingual situation like this, you're going to find code mixing to a greater or lesser extent. And then circumlocution is something you're going to find very often among second and third generation because they simply don't have the vocabulary needed in Spanish to say everything they want to say, so they're always having to beat around the bush or throw in an English word. Those are your two choices, right? Either you say it in English or you find some wild way to walk around it and finally get your point across, all right? As it turns out, quite often second and third generation don't have a need they may not be with monolingual speakers of Spanish enough that they're forced to come up with Spanish words or ways of saying things in Spanish. You just simply switch to English because if you're hanging around people who are bilingual, all of us who hang around people who are bilingual know that it catches on. You just mix, right? And of course, linguistic insecurity in Spanish. Okay, let me give you some examples. I hope we can hear this. I have to be very quiet. This is Juanita Gutierrez from Fremont, Ohio, and she is going to simply say something about her background. And it's all in Spanish because I thought it would be better for you all to follow along with the Spanish, even if you don't understand it, just to hear what her Spanish sounds like. And of course, she's going to be throwing in English words. How do you say Fremont in Spanish?
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Juanita Gutierrez. Tengo 43 años. Estoy casada, mi esposo se llama Manuel y tengo 4 hijos. 3 que ya están casados y tengo un hijo de 14 años que me queda en casa. Tengo 3 nietos y otro que viene por camino. Yo nací aquí en Fremont, Ohio, nací y fui criada aquí en Fremont. Fui a la escuela en Batsville, un pueblito del sur de aquí, que es unos 13 millas de aquí.
So, it sounds a lot like Mexican Spanish, right? There are a few features that those of y'all who are in Spanish might have noticed that she says millas instead of millas. The loss of that intervocalic Y sound is very typical of Mexican American all over the U.S. And then she says que es como unos 13 millas de aquí. So there's some morphological things and syntactic things that are a little bit different that a monolingual Spanish speaker from another country, from a Spanish-speaking country, would not do. And yet her Spanish is really, really good. Am I right? I mean, her Spanish is really good. She was born and raised in Ohio. All right? Now, listen to Jaime, and you'll notice that his Spanish is also very good. It's strong, but it's not as strong as Juanita's.
Me llamo Jaime Sierra, nací en el año 1963 en un pueblito en Ohio llamado Defiance, Ohio. Mis padres se mudaron ahí en los años 50 del siglo pasado y ahí crearon 8 hijos, somos 4 hombres y tengo 4 hermanas. Yo soy el sexto hijo de los 8. Y desde niños era muy importante hablar español en la casa, como mis padres son de México es la idioma de ellos y era muy importante que nosotros pudiéramos hablar ese idioma y inglés.
I'll stop right there. But those of y'all who are Spanish speakers have noticed that he's insecure. He's making a few what we would call agreement errors, like gender agreement with his adjectives and his nouns and that sort of thing, and sort of makes up words as he goes along. It's perfectly intelligible. And I still continue to say, I remember when I interviewed him several years ago, I said, if my children speak that well when they're your age, I will think that's just the coolest thing. To have been born and raised and never left the U.S. This is really something.
Is he the firefighter?
He's a firefighter. Yeah. He used to be the only Hispanic firefighter and paramedic in Columbus when I interviewed him. Since then, there have been others, but I mean, he had his work cut out for him years ago. Okay, and now we're going to see an example that's a sample that's even more extreme in the sense that Luis's parents did not come from Mexico. His grandmother did. And so he is farther away from monolingual Spanish and only spent a few years with his grandmother. And so it's interesting, you'll see that he has much more linguistic insecurity. But again, I think it's marvelous that he speaks so well.
Pues yo nací en Freeman, Ohio, y por un tiempo vivimos en Freeman, desde cuando nací hasta los 6 años, porque fui al Head Start en Freeman, y fui al kindergarten, y luego después de eso nos fuimos a vivir en Gibsonburg, que es un pueblito chiquito, y ahí vive mi abuelita, mi abuelito y mi tía, que es un año mayor que yo, y compramos una trailita, ¿esa dice? House trailer, y mi papá lo puso en el ¿cómo se dice? El yard, ¿cómo se dice yard? ¿Cómo se dice? El terreno de mi abuelita. Vivimos cerca porque ella vivía en una casa que era más antes era.
Bueno, you can see that he's farther away from Spanish and he's missing a lot of vocabulary, but the base is there. And so now if we, one of the things I wanted to mention about Northwest Ohio is that the last two speakers we saw don't distinguish between a tap and a trilled R. So none of them are rolling their R's when they say barrio, for example. They just say barrio. And that's very common in Mexican American. In fact, if you know the song, the Los Lobos song, Para Bailar La Bamba, right? They say arriba y arriba instead of arriba y arriba. And so they come by it honestly. It's classic Mexican American. Oh, Ancina. Yeah.
So that's still the road hero.
Yeah. He's got all the trappings. Okay, now in Northeast Ohio, in the Puerto Rican community, they're consonant weak as opposed to being consonant heavy, and so they do tend to delete their S's and to delete actually a lot of other consonants and to neutralize consonants. If you want the layman's term, it would be confused. They confuse their consonants, and so their R's and their L's are being confused and their S's are deleting, etc. Okay? But interestingly enough, I mean, and it makes sense, as far as the lexicon and their what they do, these other discourse features, they still have code mixing, of course. They're in an English-speaking world, so they mix Spanish and English. They're linguistically insecure. They circumlocute, and they have a very limited Spanish vocabulary. So this family was kind enough to invite me into their home. And so they are born and raised in Lorain, Ohio, and they've never been outside the U.S.
Laura Alicia Ríos, 41 años.
Kenwin Field,
Este es mi esposo Kevin. mi hija Megan, tengo dos hijos, Antonio y Gabriel, tienen 20, ya el mayor tiene 20 años y el otro tiene 18. Nos criamos aquí en Lorraine, Ohio, parte de los padres, bueno, los abuelos venir a Lorraine a buscar trabajo en el steel mill, que queda en la calle 28. También la mamá mía, ella vino de Nueva York, ella viene de otro lado, el hermano de...
Well, I don't want to spend too much time doing all of that, but later on, well, there are several things that we could compare there. Their R's are very different, and the guy has a R instead of the tap R, and several other features that come right out of Puerto Rico. And it's interesting that, you know, so far from Puerto Rico, and yet their Spanish is very, very Puerto Rican.
Can I ask you a quick
Yeah.
question? She said, mi mamá viene del otro lado. Does that mean the same thing as it does to Mexicans?
That was my assumption. In other words, from Puerto Rico, right? Yeah, del otro lado. Because it's not a rio, but good there. Then there's some other Ohio Spanishes, and so I'll mention two. Somebody was talking about Judeo-Spanish today at lunch, and so I will play part of this video that I made in Cincinnati of a couple, Sephardic Jewish couple from Istanbul who have lived for decades and decades in Cincinnati. And they are descendants of the Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus left Spain to come to America. And their families have never been back. And so they settled in North Africa, in the old Ottoman Empire, in the Balkans, and other places. And the Judeo-Spanish colonies are still speaking Spanish to this day, after over 500 years, in places like Salonika, Smyrna, Izmir in Turkey, and in Istanbul, and Sarajevo in Bosnia. And so I'll let you hear some of this. This is, to some extent, it's 15th century Spanish with, you know, changes that have happened, but not changes that have anything to do with Spain or Latin America. This is something that's just, you know, evolved independently once it was separated from the rest of the Spanish-speaking world.
Y como todos, cuando vinimos aquí, morimos en un apartamento cerca a la escuela. Cada día caminaba yo del apartamento a la escuela y no teníamos carro del todo. Y después de 3 años merquimos esta casa y merquimos un carro. Y de aquel tiempo que estamos morando aquí, tenemos una huerta, porque yo me engrandecí en un lugar donde había huerta. Aunque vengo de una grande ciudad, metrópolis, era, decimos, un poburgo, que es un barrio de Istanbul.
He said un barrio. So this is the other dialect of Spanish that doesn't distinguish between tap R's and trill R's. And so all in Northwest Ohio and here, I have 3 speakers saying barrio instead of barrio. Could you understand it? I mean, it's Spanish. It's amazing how much.
Latino is further from Spanish. The way Yiddish is
Yeah,
further from German.
Right. I always expected it to be, and I was amazed I could understand everything. But I've talked to other people, and they say that, I mean, part of it is that those of us who study the language and study historical linguistics, I mean, it sounds a lot like Old Spanish and a lot like Portuguese, but I think a lot of it is intelligible. But I said to them when I was there, well, do you ever talk to the immigrant community here in Cincinnati? You know, when you run across Mexicans in the grocery store, and he says, oh, we wouldn't understand each other. I thought, well, that's the weirdest thing, is we're speaking Spanish right now to each other. Yeah.
Did you speak to them in Spanish?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, go figure. So, and of course, they call what they speak, they don't call it Judeo-Spanish or Latino or Judesmo, they call it Español. because that's what they were speaking, was Espanol, right? And so, I mean, you could look at it from their perspective. It's the rest of the Spanish-speaking world where the Spanish has evolved into something else, and they're still speaking 15th century Spanish, right? Okay. I did want to say something about language, dialect, and social class, because I don't want to overstate the whole dialect picture. These dialects that we've listened to here, I mean, with the possible exception of some things having to do with Judeo-Spanish, these are mutually intelligible dialects. So Puerto Ricans understand Mexicans perfectly well, right? And vice versa. But they are far apart on the dialect continuum, because Puerto Rican Spanish is very consonant weak. Mexican Spanish is very consonant heavy. But the other thing that needs to be said is that from a linguistic standpoint, all dialects are perfectly good systems of communication. There is no dialect that is any better than any other dialect. And we use the term dialect simply to mean variety of a language. So everyone speaks some variety of the language or languages they speak. I speak, you know, the variety, you know, most of y'all speak something, some sort of variety of, you know, northern, well, North Midland or Ohio English, let's say. And by and large, attitudes about dialects are attitudes about the people who speak those dialects. So if you know, when there are very strong feelings that a certain dialect is ugly, or a certain dialect, you know, there's a certain way people shouldn't speak, it's because of the associations of that variety with people, with a certain people from a certain place, or certain types of people, a certain population, right? As far as linguists are concerned, it doesn't matter. And there are many, many examples of features in language that in one language people will say, oh, that's the most horrible thing, the way they drop their R's. It's just, you know, it's just awful, you know. They don't even, like, you know, they're in Andalusian, southern Spain, they drop R's. In the Caribbean, there are people who don't, instead of saying carne, they say carne, all right? Or carne, so they drop their R's or they do something else with it. Isn't it interesting, though, that the British drop their R's when they speak English, and we don't consider that substandard or slovenly. We consider it prestigious. So it all has to do with attitudes about people. It doesn't have to do with attitudes about the language itself, okay? We project those attitudes onto the language. The other thing I need to say is that in spite of the fact that Mexicans, by and large, are consonant heavy in their Spanish, there are also class distinctions in language, and we all know that from English. There are ways of speaking that mark you as being a rural Mexican Spanish speaker or from a certain social class. And those things are important. They're important because those are labels, those are ways that we relate to people. And so one of the things that I do as a general rule when I'm in my own classes, and I'm teaching pronunciation, for example, I make students practice the way everybody says things, because I want them to know, I'm not telling them they have to say it this way. They don't have to say Pepsi, for example. If they want to say Pepsi, that's fine. Because there are Spanish speakers who notice the difference between Pepsi and Pepsi. All right, and they might make fun of people who say Pepsi. That's what that whole advertising campaign was so funny, right? But in every country, there are people who say Pepsi. And I want my students to know, I want them to be able to relate to that and say, when they hear Pepsi, I want them to know what it means. And I want them to be able to speak in a way that's appropriate to the situation. There may be a situation where they want to say Pepsi because they want to fit in. And language, dialect, variety, that's all about fitting in. It's being part of the group. And so one of the things that we need to get away from sometimes is this notion of correctness. What we need to do is think in terms of appropriateness. What's the appropriate way to speak in a certain context, right?
I would add that kids, these, you know, I teach middle school, but I teach high school credit classes. They soak that in. They love to look at those differences and learn slang or whatever. Like, I was amazed this year, the kids fell in love with Mexican Coke. So when we went on our field trip, they were asking for Coca. They just loved to say that,
Yeah,
and just,
yeah.
it surprised me, it really did, because I didn't think they would
Yeah.
see them
No,
that.
they absolutely do. I gave a presentation at the Spanish Club at Westerville North High School, where I had a son who was in the Spanish Club there. I gave a presentation on dirty words because he said that they had been dying for the dirty words presentation. I said, okay, I will do this, but only if I couch it in terms of, language change, and I'm going to teach them something. And I said, and I wrote to the teacher and I said, if you'll send home a note, promise me you'll send home a note to the students, to their parents, saying that that's what we're going to talk about that day, and if they don't want to show up, they don't need to, because the Spanish Club is, voluntary. And so I was able to let loose, and you're right, they're curious, and not just because they're dirty words. They want to know the way young people in those other places are talking. Right? And so I think I've already mentioned Spanglish, but Spanglish is, just it's a mix. Are y'all going to talk some more about that? Or
I'm
no?
going to talk a little bit, but go ahead.
Okay. I mean, I really don't have a whole lot to say, except it's the order of the day. When you have two languages in the same space, it's clear that they're going to rub off on each other. And there are a lot of ways that happens. Spanglish there's not just one monolithic thing called Spanglish. There are a lot of different ways that you can mix Spanish and English. And we won't go into all of that. You can come take a course with me. I'm happy to talk about it. I'm teaching language change in the fall, in fact. So I'm happy to talk about it then. But I will give you a cool example or two. And this happens to be from my own children. This is some bilingual language acquisition going on in Columbus, Ohio. And these are my son Caleb and my son Reuben. And here are some Calebisms. He said, whoever arregla el árbol puede ser el árbol's friend. Okay? And then he says, shut up means que be quiet. El agua is going to be fría if you don't hurry up, Reuben. Trying to get his brother to get in the tub. Okay, and then Reuben said, when my parents came to visit, of course my parents are monolingual English speakers, and his Spanish was somewhat stronger than his English at the time. And he said, I lit my brother my dump truck for playhee. And that is, yo dejé a mi hermano mi camión para que jugara él. That is Spanish word order completely. And he took the English words and stuck them in the Spanish phrase. And then he said later, he was already, 4 years old when he said, cuando la mamá take me a la escuela, he take me almohada. He was having real he and she issues for a long time. I mean, he was probably seven years old when I was still catching him say he when he meant she. Okay, and then once he said, do you think que sí? I think que no. And of course, it's funny to me, it's funny for us, it was funny for my wife, but it wasn't funny for them. They were just talking. This is just the way you talk, right? I mean, and I would just write them down as soon as I would hear them. And okay, I need to say something about the role of service learning, because you often hear the term service learning thrown around, but I want to set the record straight about what it is. There is a website that y'all can go to. It's right there, servicelearning.osu.edu. And it's from the Service Learning Scholars Roundtable, those of us who are working in service learning, doing courses and projects. And there's a lot of information there that you can study up on it, and a lot of links to good reading. But basically, service learning is a form of experiential education characterized by student participation in an organized service activity that is connected to specific learning outcomes. Okay, that's really important. It meets identified community needs. That's really important. The community is a huge part of service learning. And it provides structured time for student reflection and connection of the service experience to learning. Which is to say that once you prepare students to go into the field, you send them into the field, they come back and you reflect on what happened in the context of what you're studying in the course. The reason that this is important to keep in mind is that people think we give credit for service. We do not give credit for service. We don't give credit for knowing Spanish. If we gave credit for service, We could go out and give diplomas to hardworking people who have never been to college, right? If we gave credit for knowing Spanish, my mother-in-law would have a diploma. And she went to school for 2 years because she was 7 years old when the Spanish Civil War broke out. So you get where I'm coming from, right? It's service learning. It has to be tied to learning. There's service involved, and the community must be a member, a partner in determining what gets done, okay? So rather than Ohio State, we're famous for going out in the community and telling people what they need, right? Or telling people to come to campus and making them pay to park, right? And then telling them what they need. And so the idea is that we work with community partners, right?
I mentioned something about that on one of our discussion boards, but I think, OSU offered a service learning class last quarter. I don't know if they're going to do it again, but with the outreach program, or the Columbus City outreach classes, that was one of their, I don't know how often they're going to do it. I think this was the first.
So it was an education course on service learning, about service learning?
Professor Kinlock is her name, but she did, the whole quarter was on that. We all had to kind of come up with our own project. We didn't have to necessarily implement it yet, but we had to write a grant proposal that was due to her. And
Great.
Actually, because I guess they have got some money for grants, so whoever kind of had the best project will get up to like 50.
So you would recommend it to the?
Yeah, I talked, because somebody wrote something on here about something, understanding students. They were talking about how can we better understand, just getting students to care about others, and specifically, some of the immigrant students, and I said service learning is a way to do that. But yeah, I don't know what the website's like, but there's a huge book for class for free, you take it, and lots of ideas, and you get to go to different community agencies throughout the campus. It's a pretty good class.
And as it turns out, students love doing service. There was a time when they didn't, when people didn't have that tradition of service. And there are a lot of cultures where people don't have a tradition of service. There's no tradition of philanthropy, for example. But here you see that among our students, and I see it more and more, where students, they come to us asking if they can do service learning, and we think they want credit, and so we get all bent out of shape and say, well, you can take the course, and then you come to find out all they want to do is just go serve.
They actually say that, I guess, statistically, you have a better chance of, they were talking about Latino students specifically, I guess, they have a higher graduation rate when they take part in this sort of, that's why I took the class, because I work with ESL students. But they say kids are more involved, take more ownership in their education when they do service learning.
Yeah, not surprising. So it gives us all purpose. It addresses community needs, and learning increases exponentially. I can certainly say that's been the case in Spanish. Language skills, the retention of our students, which is part of what you're talking about, retention of students, and of course the excitement. As far as the community partners, I have a list here of, if y'all will go to my webpage, ¿dónde era que teníamos is that a whiteboard?
Yeah, whiteboard.
You know what I should do is let me just hand out my card. My website's at the bottom of that card there. And if you'll go to my website and just click on opportunities, then it'll take you to a volunteering link. And you can see this list of our community partners. And these are organizations that anyone can go to, and it has a contact person to use your Spanish in the community. And in some of these places, you don't really need Spanish even. There are lots of other things you can do. But it's color-coded here. The key, it tells you whether or not it's on the CODA bus line, because that's important for our students who don't have cars. Whether or not you need training, because there are some places in order to work there, you really need to be trained first, and sometimes you have to pass background checks and that sort of thing. And of course, we see this as a way to professionalize our curriculum also, and to turn our Spanish majors into professionals. And many of them actually, believe it or not, get jobs based on the work that they do, the service learning projects that they do, because they're able to network with people who are involved in with the Hispanic communities. And the outcomes, as I said earlier, they include some sort of product or project that the students have to do. And so I have examples of journals and projects. Let's look at the journals first. What our students have to do, I said that they have to spend 100 hours outside of class during the quarter, 10 hours a week. They have to identify the activities that they take part in. I couldn't come up with the right noun there. I'm losing my English. They have to document it. So if they go, let's say they go to a church service on Sunday at the Catholic Church, they go to Mass, they have to get the bulletin from the Mass and paste it in their scrapbook. They have to reflect on what on the experience in the context of what we're talking about in class. Reflection is not just going out there and saying, we did this, this, and this, and I thought it was great. It's actually reflecting based on the cultural material that we deal with in class. For a while, I wanted them to do correction. I wanted them to meet with native speakers, but I found that I'm coming clean with you here. This is one of the things that you should not use your native speaker partners for. It's hard to write something and then sit down with a native speaker just by virtue of them being a native speaker and expect them to correct your composition. That's not, I mean, people correct compositions when they're trained as English teachers, right? To correct, they know how to teach you to write. There are a lot of Spanish speakers we come in contact with who are wonderful resources for language and all kinds of things, but not for correcting your compositions. Let me give you an example of one of the reasons. There are so many reasons why this is inappropriate, but the first time I taught the course, I knew that my students were coming in contact with native speakers of Spanish through Big Brothers, Big Sisters, work at the clinics. Some of them were working at Chipotle, and so they were working with Mexican guys, you know. And so I figured they would all know someone who could help them correct the occasional paragraph. And then it dawned on me when a student turned in a paragraph that a friend of hers had corrected. The paragraph was really awful. I mean, the Spanish was dreadful. All right, this is a student who had never been outside of Franklin County, probably. Early in the quarter, she was a Spanish major, but her Spanish wasn't very strong. And this Mexican friend of hers had scratched through one word and written another word on top of it. And I thought to myself, he's a native speaker of Spanish. How could he not see that the paragraph needed lots of work? And then over the time I thought about that. I thought, you know, first of all, we don't even know to what extent he could read or write. Now, as it turns out, he could read and write because he had written something on there. But that's not something we should expect, and we certainly shouldn't put somebody in a situation where they have to correct. Even if he had 10 or 12 years of school and could read and write, can you imagine the culture shock or the culture weirdness of having this Mexican, let's say, a rural Mexican man who has been a laborer, all right, correcting the Spanish of a woman who is from a much higher social class. She's American. She's wealthy by comparison, and she almost has a university degree. So putting someone in a situation where you say, now you correct her Spanish, it's just not going to happen. It's very, very inappropriate. And I was embarrassed later that I had sent my students out assuming that they would have the relationships with people. I mean, at the time, we didn't know who they were going to run into, but we knew there were Spanish speakers out there. And that's the sort of thing I do with Spanish speakers because I know how to do field research, and so I know what questions to ask to find out whether this is the way you say it or not. But we hadn't trained our students to do that. And also, it's not appropriate in most cases to set up a situation where you set them up as the teacher and you're the student. That's not what it's about. It's about other kinds of relationships that we want to develop in the networks that we're having our students create, right? Was there a question back there?
Just a question and a comment maybe. Like on Facebook and sometimes in some of my interactions with Spanish speakers here in Central Ohio, sometimes I get the feeling that if you don't already have friends that are within that network and you try to make a friend or you touch base with somebody, I found that people kind of feel like you're taking advantage of their Latino-ness or their language speaking skills just to take advantage. Did your students run into that a lot? And how can we get past that? I mean, I assume really trying to make friends and not just trying to.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly what you're saying, and it is. I'm embarrassed when I think of the times where I've wanted to tap into native speaker intuitions, right? That people have. I do it with my own wife, and I have a really good story I'll tell you. It's so embarrassing. Linguists are trained to elicit data. That's what we need to teach students to do, really. That's what I try to teach my students to do, but we need a lot more time than we have in the Spanish in Ohio class. But there's a way that you can elicit data from people without saying to them, I want to make sure I say this in a way that everybody's going to understand what I'm talking about. In Spanish, there's a subjunctive and there's an indicative, right? There are two modes for every verb is going to be either in the subjunctive or the indicative. And this is a structure that isn't parallel to the same thing in English. And so it's really hard for non-native Spanish speakers of English, to know whether to use the subjunctive or the indicative. And so often we'll find ourselves in a situation where we want to say something and it's like, do we use the subjunctive or do we use the indicative? Now you can't just go to a Spanish speaker and say, shall I use the subjunctive here or the indicative? Because they're not going to know. They're not going to know how to answer that question. They are going to know the answer to the question, but they know it tacitly. They know it subconsciously, unconsciously, right? And so what we do as field researchers is that we just think of some way to put that sentence in their mouth and get them to say it. And then, oh, okay, it's the subjunctive. And then you know you've got the answer to your question. Nowadays what you can do is you can simply Google the two choices. Like you've got a phrase, you know, Google it, the whole phrase with the indicative, Google it with the subjunctive, and see which one gets you 2,000 hits, right? That's the one that native speakers are using, right? But I would hear my wife say these interesting things that they weren't exactly textbook, right? She would say things. She's a native Spanish speaker from Spain, and so she would say things when we were first married, and I would hear that. I think, wow, I've never heard that structure before. I wonder if anybody's ever written a paper about it. It's really hard to live with a linguist. So, but I can remember once. We had just come home from a really long day at, this is when I was in grad school, and she was working full time, right? And so we get home, and of course, she starts to make supper, and I start to sit down at the computer and do something stupid, like study or whatever, you know? So here she is, she's working all day, and she comes home and she makes dinner, and so she's getting the potatoes, right? She's getting ready to get the potatoes ready for supper, and so she says something about the potatoes, and then she says, can you help me peel them? But she says, Spanish speakers will really appreciate that. She says, ¿me puedes pelarlas?
Wow.
Wow. It's like you can't say that. It's impossible. Can I put it on the board here?
Yeah.
All right, so there's, ¿me puedes pelarlas? All right, so there are these two pronouns, okay, in Spanish. And the textbooks say that these pronouns have to stay together. You can't separate them like this. You have to say, me las puedes pelar or puedes pelarmelas with both of them here. But my wife said this. As God is my witness, my wife said this. Okay? So, ¿qué pasa? So, oh, okay, all right. Not in Spain, I don't think, but anyway. So, okay. We won't go there. We'll do that tonight over drinks. So anyway, so of course, my wife is used to the fact that I'm always discovering these things, right? And getting her to say, can you say it this way or can you say it this way? You know, And that's what we're always trying to tap into intuitions. And we say like, well, could you say this? Can you, which sounds better? All this stuff. So as soon as she says this, my eyes light up, right? And I say, oye, you know, like, hey. And she says to me, no, you can't say it. I'm tired. In other words, she just said it, and she knew that it was ungrammatical.
Yeah.
It was something that you can't say. Unless you study language, you might not realize this, but we're always saying things that are ungrammatical. We're always, you start out to say one thing, and you end up saying something else in the same sentence. So she started out saying, me puedes, and she was going to say something else. And then she ended up with pelarlas. She knew it was wrong, but she didn't have the energy to go back and say, wait a second, I just had an ungrammatical sentence, let's start over. So, but this, I think it gets to the point, because the point is, we're on the lookout for, we don't have the native intuitions, and we want somebody to help us with those native intuitions. And you can't, no matter what anybody says, you can't go to a book and find that out. There are a lot of things that the native speaker is the one who's going to be the source. They're the ones who are going to tell you, is that the way you say it or not? And notice we're not talking about educated native speakers necessarily. We're talking about any native speaker of any language has intuitions. That's how we all understand each other, right? And so, you know, anyone, my mother-in-law is a great example. I mean, la pobre. She studied for school for 2 years, right? That's all she went to school. But she is my perfect example of everything, because when I want to know the way real people say things, I ask my mother-in-law, you know? But I can't just ask her, hey, do you use the subjunctive here? Whatever, you know, I set up the situation and get her to come out with it. And so, I mean, really, online it's kind of hard, but there are things that you can ask people, you know, like give them 2 sentences and say which one sounds better. You know, but getting back to that and to the point I was making, I think, is it's really hard to correct people's language, you know, and it really, because I was once sitting at Buckeye Donuts years and years ago, really late at night, and a grad student from another department, another college, was sitting next to me, and he was working on his thesis. And he kept asking me all these questions about which sounds better, you know, in English. And it was like, it's not an easy answer. If it were really one thing, you could just say, oh, go with this one, and then move on to donuts and coffee. But it's not that easy. It's like language is not black and white. It's very gray. And so correcting a paragraph is very difficult, right? It's like, where do you start, you know? So in the end, I guess we all need to back up. And I'm, you know, guilty as charged. We all need to back up and say, wait a second, I'm not gonna torture these people. Instead, I want to do what you were describing. Let's create another kind of relationship. And then there will be ways that we can, you know, my Spanish will improve by being in the company of that person. No sé. I mean, it doesn't answer the question, but it acknowledges that it's a really good question. Dime.
The other thing is that when people spend a long time here, they start with the calques, you know?
Yeah.
The calques from calques is when they take a grammatical structure from English and they use Spanish words to fill it in. So it's not a grammatical structure from Spanish. And that's a calque. And sometimes they don't distinguish anymore. So when there are people who use them as resources to learn Spanish, they're getting calques.
Right.
Not getting
Spanish. And it happens at a whole lot of levels. That's really good. And there's a word alfombra, which means rug, okay? And in Latin America, I think for the most part, this would be an alfombra, right? So el piso está alfombrado, right? And in Spain, it's moqueta, if it's this kind of thing, where it's like wall to wall. And so when we first got married and moved to the U.S., my wife heard people in Texas they were calling it carpeta, which of course comes from carpet. So they just take the word carpet and make it into a Spanish word. And there already is a word carpeta in Spanish, and it means this is a carpeta, all right? It's a little notebook or something. All right. So my wife just thought that was I mean, here she was straight off the boat from Spain, right? And she didn't even speak any English. But she would hear things like that, and she would laugh, and she'd say, oh my gosh, their Spanish is just so awful. Okay, she's been here 31 years. Just last month, she had some Salvadorans come through Right Rug, all right? They came and put in new carpet in our house. She was on the phone with this guy, and I heard her saying, la carpeta, la carpeta, la carpeta. And then when she hung up, I said, la carpeta. And she said, oh, well, you know, if I don't say that, he won't know what I'm talking about. She just took the path of least resistance. That, you know, is appropriate to say carpeta here. She can't say that back home, but...
They think you're a snob.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you
exactly.
educated,
right.
you know,
yeah. Right.
It happens to
exactly.
me, I have to
That's
use my
it.
dialect.
That's right. That's it. It's appropriateness. So you go with what's appropriate. We get away from correctness. What's appropriate? Why do we talk in the first place? To be understood, for heaven's sakes. And of course, linguists don't care. I mean, you know, as a linguist, it really doesn't matter whether you call it carpeta or alfombra. All that matters is that you understand each other. That's what language is all about. So, are we okay?
I don't know.
I need some time, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Then why don't I,
Every day this happens.
let me just give you the examples of projects. I think that's probably the main thing that, is that the main thing that we?
They will have to do something similar.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know what point y'all are at in your projects, but here's, okay. Well, the journals, they don't have to do journals, do they?
No.
Okay. The journals that our students do are something like, they can do any format they want, but they have to do all their documentation and reflection and everything. And then a lot of them do really cool things like take pictures of all these activities and put them in a scrapbook or whatever. Some of them do, this one student did it all online, sort of like as a, no, ¿qué es lo que quiero decir? Sort of like a blog, but then also with pictures of, I mean, incredible job. And I can show you those to y'all later, but let me give you examples of some of the things that the students did as their final projects that they actually did in the Hispanic community. What they did was, this one student created books on tape. You remember back, I mean, now it would be, I don't know, it would be all digital, but this was back when the cassette tapes existed, right? And what she had was she actually went to native Spanish speakers and had them read these different stories, and then she inserted the little bell where the child was supposed to turn the page, right? So another student had worked at Head Start in Southwest City Schools, and since you're supposed to have your community partners tell you what the needs are, the transportation director said there was a real problem with parents of the children not knowing how the bus system worked. And so this student made a video that they could, in Spanish, that they could show to the parents that told them how the buses worked, and they filmed the children getting on the bus and told them what time they needed to be out there and explained how important it was that they be there at a certain time, and they showed them how the whole bus route went and everything. And she solved a community need. The other thing to notice here is that the student herself she wasn't on the video. Often our students think that they need to sort of get out there and be in front, or else it's not a real project. And I kept telling them, you know what? Get a native speaker to narrate the video. You don't need to narrate that video. You can if you want. But the important thing is that this project would not get done if it weren't for you. And you have to work with native Spanish speakers in order to do it. And that's what's really cool. You're getting the input. Another student worked with those children at Lincoln Park West Apartments, and then had the kids sing songs that they knew from Mexico, not from memory, songs that they all brought with them from Mexico. And then she made a cassette tape for use in Spanish classes of those kids singing songs, and she made a little booklet to go with it, with the words to the songs that the students sang. So as opposed to being something where you would go to the library, you go to the internet and you look up songs, you go to native Spanish speakers and you hear them sing, and then you simply transcribe. And I tell the students, You don't do this in a vacuum. If there's something you don't understand in that song, get the child to sit down with you and tell you what it is they're saying. Let them be the experts, and you observe. Another student worked at a middle school in Whitehall, and they came up with a booklet for new immigrant students in Spanish, describing the school and the school day and the school activities and that sort of thing. Another student was at a loss as to what to do, and I said, well, what do you like to do? Because it turns out she was a billiards expert. I mean, she had won competitions in Ohio, and so she set up a pool competition and held it at Lincoln Park West Apartments. She had worked with the students in an after-school program and taught them how to play pool. And then they had a competition, and she got local restaurants to give the prizes and that sort of thing. And another student was Mexican-American, but she didn't know her relatives in Mexico, and so she researched that as her project. And in part of doing that, she had to actually call relatives in Mexico that she had never talked to before. Another student, I'm really proud of this. There was no Mass in Spanish on the east side of Columbus the year that I taught this particular edition of the course. And so the student worked with the priest at the Pontifical College Josephinum, north of Worthington, and they set up a Mass in Spanish at Christ the King Church. And she did all of the publicity and posted flyers around on the east side. And ever since then, there has been Mass on the east side, and La Iglesia Cristo Rey. Another student worked, this was in a course where they didn't know Spanish. It was a lot like this class where you weren't expected to know Spanish. And this particular student worked in nutrition at OSU. And so we brainstormed for a while and then decided that she would get friends of hers or friends of hers to come to her house and make meals, entire meals from their homeland. And then she made a PowerPoint with all of the how-to make all these meals. And then she researched all the nutrition and actually came up with the little nutrition facts, because they do that in her office with the nutrition facts for every one of the meals. Another student did an artifact box of artifacts that she found in the Mexican grocery stores, and then she described the products, the practices, and the perspectives in order to hit on all of the points that are expected in the teaching of culture. I won't go into all of that. Some of the projects were events rather than actual products. So there were parent-teacher conferences, for example, at different schools where one student would contact all the parents and Hispanic parents, and then another student would be in charge of some other aspect of it, and then they would have a night where all the Spanish-speaking parents would come in and our students would take them around to all the different teachers, and then there would be someone to translate, to interpret at every station along the way. Another one worked with bed bugs and tenants' rights and did a presentation at one of the apartment complexes on tenants' rights and the whole bed bug issue, which makes you, we all were itching after that presentation. And some of the most interesting projects, I can give y'all can look at these if you want, are the ones that have menus of possibilities. And so here's one from a high school in Dublin, this was in Spanish, where the students had to choose something from each category, and everything had a point value, and she sent them around town to do things. And this is nice because it's appropriate to the high school setting. So whereas in our course, we send students around to do things I can say they can go to the mass, they can go to the bars, they can go to Latin night at these clubs or all these different things. You can't send high school kids out to the bars. So this is all appropriate to the high school context. And it's also something that can be done over a period of several months. So the students know early that they have to get a total of 25 points during the semester. So anyway, y'all can look at those. I'll just wrap it up there maybe. I've got some more videos and let's just, está bien. I think we're running way behind, so. Questions? Do we have time for a question?